Hey Heather, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Hey Ruth, how are
Hi
you doing?
guys.
Appreciate it. Hey Ruth, how are
Hi
you doing?
guys. Good. How are you guys?
Doing good.
Hi Maggie. How are you?
I'm doing well, and you?
Good.
So guys, just before we go ahead and get started, if you guys haven't heard about this case before, please drop any color heart down in the chat. That'll kind of let us know who's heard about this case before, who hasn't, and it will kind of depend on where we start. Um, So, Maggie, before we get into the actual hard things to talk about, do you want to talk about a little bit about Brittany, how she was?
Sure. Brittany was somebody who really seemed exceptional from the day she was born, even. She came out looking without hair, looking like an angel, which, was maybe a foreboding. But she, even at 2, 3, 4, she was fearless. She would jump in pools backwards. She would climb trees. I think we started calling her middle name Accident when she was about 4 because she had already had stitches in her chin and her forehead. She always seemed a bit older in her forehead. She always seemed a bit older than her age. She even started school early. So she was a year younger than most kids, in all her high school, college, everything. But she was still emotionally, the same age as people. Highly intelligent. Of course, I'm a prejudiced mother, but beautiful with long blonde curls surrounding these deep, dark set eyes that people say when they see her picture in the car on my car that sometimes those eyes just draw them in. And, those eyes, when she would look at me, I couldn't say no usually. She graduated from high school in Tulsa with a full ride chemistry scholarship. She ended up going to my alma mater to study chemistry. That was what her scholarship was in, and she wanted to be a cancer researcher. But she also had all these other interests. I danced for most of my life. She danced. She was in gymnastics, she did theater. She was only 5'2", which she blamed on my genes and stuff. But she did modeling just because she had this beautiful angelic face. And so she would do different types of modeling, not the typical ones that you see with 5'7" and everything. And if you see that purple picture of her, that was actually a comp card that was done. And the way she was so much like a chameleon. If you look at that picture, I'm assuming everybody can see that there's that purple dress and then those pigtail type of picture that's down there. That was on the same day. We were just trying different looks with the photographer and stuff. But, she was very compassionate. I've been a trauma psychologist for about 37 years. And she and her brother both sometimes would come with me when I was first responding to tornadoes. She was with me when the Oklahoma City bombing happened. I mean, she didn't go up there right away, but it was one of the first times that they had those fences where you put stuffed animals on. Now everybody does that, but we had never seen that before. And she, every time she went up with me, which was 3 because I was working the crisis line, um, she would end up putting those on the fence and being tearful, but then we talk about it. But I don't know,
So,
there's so much
Maggie,
about her.
forgive me for interrupting, but real quick before I forget, was Brittany born and raised in Oklahoma?
No, she was actually, I went to college for 12. Went to college and then lived there for 12 years. So she and her brother were born in St. Petersburg, Florida, and we lived there till about they were 4 and 5. They were Irish twins, so they were only 15 months apart. And then we came up to Louisville where I just worked for a year or two as a writer and starting some psychology courses because my bachelor had been in writing. And then that we came out to Oklahoma in 1990 to Tulsa.
Okay. So she had roughly been there for about 5 years.
In Florida, yeah.
Okay. All right, go ahead. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. I mean, that was just a brief snapshot. I'm sure different things will come up, but she was also very creative. If you see these pictures at the bottom, she was always wearing some sort of hat and stuff. We would travel between Florida and Kentucky, and she would stop traffic because she just had these long blonde curls and everything. And when I was in Louisville, Kentucky, I was working with United Way, so that one of her pictures, or a couple of her pictures, were on all the buses across Louisville because it was seniors, Native American, minorities, young, old, and so she was the young thing type of individual that United Way helped. So she really loved that. She was only 5 or so, and she would see herself go by, on a bus or something. Or when we flew back to Louisville from Tulsa, she come into the airport and she thought she was famous because her picture was there in the airport on the United Way campaigns for a couple of years. So.
And what kind of relationship did she have with her dad?
Mixed. Part of the reason that she decided, along with getting the full ride scholarship to Florida, to Eckerd College, was her dad still lived in St. Pete, and she had gone down there in grade school to try to live a year down there with him, and it didn't go well. And she was only 8 or 9 then. So when she came back, and we had been in Tulsa for about 2 years, I guess. When she came back, and we had been in Tulsa for about 2 years, I guess. When she came back, she, didn't want any relationship with her. But then she decided, well, I'm going to go back to Florida. I'm older now, more mature. Maybe I'll have any relationship with her. But then she decided, well, I'm going to go back to Florida. I'm older now, more mature. Maybe I'll have a relationship with him. And she got pretty upset after her end of her freshman year because she said he just seemed to always be away on business. So a bit strained just because she felt somewhat abandoned. But growing up, he played music. She was very musical. She had a beautiful voice. Butterfly Kisses was a favorite song of hers that he used to play, and we actually played it at the funeral. So it was mixed, and I think he probably realized that maybe she might have. I think he probably realized that maybe she might have stayed down there if because we always do that when something bad happens. We go, if only. So, he was doing that. If only I'd seen her more, maybe she would have stayed in Florida and not come home, So, but, I've learned, and I know just for multiple reasons, but even for myself and helping other homicide families, you can't live in these if onlys. If only she hadn't come home, or even the future if only. If only we could find the killer, I'll be better. If only we could sentence him. You can't wait for those if onlys. I'll probably say this a couple of times during this, but you really, to heal, you have to learn to live in spite of, in honor of, and because of. And so, I have to live life to the fullest because I'm not going to let her murder get another victim. But I also can't let the loss just take away my life, because then her memory goes. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. So, do you want to talk a little bit about what happened to Brittany?
Sure. I'm trying to follow some people who are coming on, and I don't see a lot of familiar names, so I'll try to be brief. But when Brittany came home, she had finished her freshman year. She wanted to go to Oklahoma State University, but Eckerd College was somewhat private, so the transfer of credits was a little bit difficult. So she decided to work and go to Tulsa Junior College to get a few credits. At the same time, I had moved to Chandler, Oklahoma, which was about 50 miles from Tulsa, because I had gotten a job at a female prison and I didn't want to commute 2 hours each way. So Chandler was about 45 minutes from the prison and about 45 minutes from Oklahoma State University. So she was going to get her extra credits that she needed, and then she was going to come and live with me in Chandler, and then go to OSU. So after being back for about a month in June or July, she had lived with a friend or two, and then we said, why not look at the apartments right next door to the high school that she graduated from? Because for all the 4 years that she went there, we never heard anything bad about it. So we looked on the police website, even in '04, we knew to do that. And then, because she had graduated in '03, and then Eckerd was '03 and '04. And then they did a background check on her, which I find just so unbelievable, because we later found out they didn't do real good background checks on people in the apartment complex. But so she moved into these apartments, and she was working and she was going to school. And Tulsa Junior College has a North Campus, which is downtown Tulsa, South Campus, which is south of the city, but near her apartment. She was on 71st, and the apartment of the school was 81st. And so she would come up and see me every week. And I was staying in a hotel and coming back to a house that we rented. And I got out of that and found a house in Chandler. And she was coming up every weekend to sort of, help plan for what we were going to do in the future. And so I knew she had classes pretty late. And so and the dates are going to be really important as we go on in the story. But on September 27th, which was a Monday in '04, she called me really upset around 8:30. And she said, around 8:30, and she said that she had been in a urgent care for about 2 hours, and they weren't seeing her, and she was having all these nasal infections because she had this cutest little pug nose, but it caused her problems with her allergies. And when Brittany was 18, which she was, we buried her on her 19th birthday. When she was 18, 17, when she got upset, she was like a little girl. And so, I tried to calm her down, and I said, drive your friend home, because she always drove with a friend, to be safe. And I'll call you in the next couple of days. We'll set up an appointment. So she supposedly saw her brother that night they were at the North Campus. They saw each other in the cafeteria before she went to the urgent care. So she left the urgent care, drove home. So the next night, which was Tuesday, the 28th, I called her. Wasn't surprised she didn't answer, because she had late classes at least through Wednesday. So I just, left a quick message. Then Wednesday night, I called her. So we're out on the 28th now. And I left a message with a little irritation, but not much. But then Thursday night, which was the 29th, I called, and I don't know, I think many of us as mothers have left this type of message with our kids, and we're never expecting anything bad. But what I said was, Brittany, I know you're okay. I really hate to bother you, but I haven't talked to you in 3 days. Can you please, please, please call me and let me know you're okay? And that was Thursday, the 29th. And Thursday, the 29th. And on, let's see, maybe I've messed up the 27th, 28th, 29th, 30th. So Thursday was the 30th. I'm sorry. But so I was expecting a friend to visit me in Chandler, and there's all these storms around. So he or she was running late. And so I went to bed and didn't think anything about Brittany, being in trouble or anything. So at 1 a.m. on October 1st, I get a knock on the door. and it's thundering and it's storming, and I think it's my friend driving from Chicago. And I open the door, and this is where this case just starts, one thing after another, having very bizarre ways that it hits me in the face. But I open the door, and there's this young, baby-faced sheriff in a raincoat amid all this rain and thunder. And he looks at me, he says, "Are you Maggie Zingman?" And I go, "Yes." He hands me this little piece of paper that couldn't have been longer or wider than an inch long. And he goes, "You need to call Tulsa police, this number. Your daughter's been murdered." And then he backs out the door and leaves. So you're still there, right?
Yes, we're here.
Okay. Just want to make sure. So, nowadays we know about notifications, and I learned they did notify my son in the right way, but Chandler was a town halfway between Oklahoma City and Tulsa, and this was the Lincoln County Sheriff's that I lived right next to, and they didn't think anything about having a young man just drop off a piece of paper at 1 a.m. at night. And when you get something like that, as if people have ever been shocked by something devastating like this, you don't know what to do, and you're not necessarily thinking in any way that makes sense. So this was a 2-story, 100-year-old home. And I just remember sort of backing up and finally hitting the stairs and just falling and thinking, what am I supposed to do? Who am I supposed to call? It's 1 a.m. I don't want to call my parents in New York or my brother in California. I don't want to wake them up, which is crazy because I had to let them know that something was happening. And so I finally called them, and within 6 hours they were in town. And then I thought, how am I going to drive down there? Because it's about 50 miles away. Could I even drive? So I called my best friend, who I'd known since I had moved out there, and I moved out there in 19. And she and her husband drove up within an hour, and so we're probably at about 4 o'clock. And so then, once they get there, we start driving, her husband in his car and her and I in my car. And remember, this is 2004. So her and I in my car. And remember, this is 2004. So cell phones are not what they are now. They were the flip phones. They were, not really well made, but we did at least have that communication. And they were, not really well made, but we did at least have that communication. And about halfway there, and I have done this a lot during her murder, about halfway there, I thought, she's watched Brittany grow up since she was walking in on, the body and everything else. So about halfway there, I said, call Jim, her husband, let him know that I'm going to drive down there the rest of the way myself. And basically that's what happened. I let her go with her husband. They fought it, but I just didn't want that, her walking into what I was going to walk in. And so that was about maybe 20 minutes away from Brittany's apartment. When I got down there, the sun was just beginning to come up, but it was still dark. And her apartments were on the back. It was a 8-plex, so you had 2 downstairs, 2 upstairs facing the back, and 2 upstairs, 2 downstairs facing the front. And hers was on the back, which caused a lot of security issues that we looked into. But I went upstairs and all the lights were on and the door was on. And I saw the 2 cats that she was taking care of till she could bring them up to my house. They were on the couch, just cornered against the corner of the couch. And I guess they had been there with her dead for 3 days. And an officer came out of the room, and he goes, "Who are you? You're not supposed to be in here." And I said, "I'm her mother. Can I see her?" And the second slap in the face came. He said, "I'm sorry, she's already been taken." And a saying that I've learned to, hate is, I've learned every year with this murder that life is not like CSI. You know, I thought I was going to have to identify the body as much as I didn't want to. I wanted to see her. And I said, well, don't I have to identify? Do I need to go to the medical examiner? He said, no, she was identified by her license. So she was taken her license. So she was taken before I even got there. And he said, but the detective should be here soon. So, you know, that's sort of what got me to the murder site. Are there any questions, or is there some question that you have about up to this point?
I personally don't. Ruth or Arctic, do you have any questions as of right now?
I'm good.
Yeah, I'm good too. It's just a lot to take in. I'm sorry you went through all this, man.
Well, you know, I know it's a lot to take in, and the crazy thing, and I really encourage people to visit me on Facebook, or if on this flyer, then I have my email, because as this case goes on, it gets so convoluted and so many twists and turns, it becomes like a badly written, made for TV movie that somebody watching it would say, oh, that can't really be true. I mean, it's just crazy. And if you're confused now, you will become even more confused down the
So
road.
before we continue on, I am gonna just remind everybody while we are listening to this case, if we can remember to tap the screen, share out the live, we would greatly appreciate it. And then also, if you haven't set your daily heart rate for the day, it really does help with the algorithm, and it does show TikTok that you like the content that you're seeing here tonight. With that being said, we can continue.
Okay. So, you know, nobody knows what to do with this. I mean, you know, now part of my passion has been trying to and I helped start the Oklahoma Homicide Survivors Support Group for OSBI. OSBI is the state FBI, you know, and that's something I learned, in which any people who are involved with criminal justice or have murdered or missing family members, you have OSBI, you have the sheriffs in each county, and then you have the cities. And unfortunately, there's still, even 20 years after her murder, there is still not a lot of communication between these different groups, you know, and stuff. And that's a really big factor with me right now, because as I'm going to tell you, the first 10 years, I had one of the best teams. My detective, Jeff Felton, the head of homicide, Mike Huff, other detectives, Mike Nance, even the chief. And I didn't necessarily always agree with them, but they taught me everything I know. They shared stuff with me and told me that I couldn't share it, and I didn't because it could hurt the case. So I had such a great team until about 2012 when Jeff retired, and a few years later, especially the last 8 years, I am being treated like the enemy. The Tulsa police refuse to communicate with me. So that's where I'll end up getting to. But that being said, I met Jeff that morning at like 5 or 6, and you know, he immediately tried to tell me what he knew. He said, you know, he thought she was raped and suffocated sometime between, now we're going back to the dates, sometime between 9 p.m., because that's when I talked to her on Monday, the 27th, and 8 or 9 a.m. on the 28th. So that is the time period. And there's some problems with our medical examiner report that we're trying to get somebody to look at. But the medical examiner in his report says this was the time of death they think, because of the, they didn't even say because of the status of the body. but he said, because that was the last time anybody said they talked with him, and when I had to look at the medical examiner's report again after I'd seen it in the early years, in 2023, when we got something that could possibly change the timeline of her death, half of the stuff was not written. All the swabs stuff was not written. All the swabs that he took was not written on it. The food description, when I saw it 2 years ago, looked like a Big Mac, like she had just eaten a Big Mac. And there's, there's Mac, and there's, there's different things about when the body decomposes. But anyways, but he told me that he thought she was raped and suffocated by where she was found. She was floor and stuff. And so, of course, he said they had DNA, they had some DNA profiles. This is '04. So remember, they didn't have the familial analysis. DNA at arrest was just being started. So back then, it's not the same things that we have now, and which I've been pushing for the current department to tell me if they're using, but they're not. But anyways, but one of the big things, and it always is brought up in this case, is he was 6'3", still is. And he goes into her closet. Of course, he was asking me, does anything look out of ordinary? No, it looked like her typical messy apartment of an 18-year-old that I saw 2 weeks before. It really didn't look out of place. But he goes into her closet, and he taps the ceiling in her closet, and he goes, were you aware of this? And I said, no. And being 6'3", he pushed up this 2-foot square little piece of wood that went into a common attic of all the upstairs apartments. Meaning, part of what we had to look at was, and part of what he did look at, because he, over the next 10 years, he looked at probably 1,000 suspects, but, service people, cable layers, phone layers, electricians, the person working around the apartment, all those people could have access to her apartment. And he, down the road a couple months later, he, from some friends' reports, and I remembered it too, is one day Brittany walked into the apartment and she thought somebody had urinated in her toilet. And that raised questions. When she first moved in there, the door was all banged in. So we had to get that replaced. We learned after her murder, because we were never told about it beforehand, that there had been a break-in 2 buildings down with a young girl like a month before she was killed that was similar. But we found out that the apartment complex did not tell anybody about things if it wasn't ever seen or investigated by the police. If it wasn't on the police website, then it wasn't. So it ended up, they took a lot of fingerprints. They ended up having, after a month or two, 5 DNA profiles, and they ended up using one of the DNA profiles from, and this is where it's going to start getting confusing for people, but from, it was, I don't know who, Ruth, you said that it was a structural failure with the way it was built. Yeah, well, interestingly enough, now it's not a common space. Now they have a gate letting people in, and they have a fence around the whole complex, except back where her apartment is, that was a wood fence that was on a field that faced a field and a storage company. That the metal fence goes around everything except there, where people could easily access it. It's just crazy. But that DNA profile of blood and semen, they started using to compare to suspect after suspect. Jeff went through all the males at the apartment complex. He went through the male friends and friends of friends. He looked at nephews and nieces and relatives of people living in the apartment that might have, a history. They worked real closely with sex crimes and other homicides. And of course, if people know, they put it up in CODIS. But CODIS in 2004, most of the states did not take DNA at arrest. Most of the states, not even all the states, were taking it at conviction. DNA doesn't mean you're guilty. DNA is just taken when it was only taken at conviction so that they could, one, match it to other crimes, and two, it is mostly to match it to other crimes. DNA at arrest, only thing it does is it gets a person off the streets before they do continual crimes. And by that, I mean, when we started only doing DNA at conviction, they would get somebody. There's a guy called, if you ever want to look up a case, look up the Ether Man. It's very interesting because the Ether Man finally was in Colorado in 2009, and Colorado and New Mexico were the only ones taking DNA at arrest. They arrested him for something. When they got his DNA from the arrest, they matched it to 19 assaults in Norman and 9 assaults in Edmond. And I don't know how many people are from Oklahoma, but those are 2 Oklahoma cities. And those assaults, because the DNA matched, because they took a swab, when people reported the rape and stuff, and then they, maybe he was arrested, but there wasn't enough evidence to convict him, so that nothing ever happened with that DNA. And so when they matched this, that means he was roaming from 1986 to 2008 in Oklahoma, raping and assaulting. And I think they finally matched him to murder. So that's why, they were starting to try to, see, we thought blood and semen had to be our killer. And Jeff, in the first year, probably had 400 suspects he compared against. And Jeff, in the first year, probably had 400 suspects he compared against. And he would go, oh, this is a really good suspect. And then it wouldn't match. There's so much I could talk about, and part of my head wants me to jump ahead, but Hopi, I just saw you're from Tulsa. Have you ever heard of this case before? I don't know. I'd like to know if anybody's heard about the case before, because the media has helped us a lot. Channel 6, Lori Fulbright has been with me since day one. Fox 23 has been there. So where do you want me to go? Or are there any questions that I could talk, obviously, for ages and ages about this.
I have a question.
Okay.
Okay, so Maggie, did you say that was an open area where you could go, like a common attic? I've never even heard it being made that way.
Yeah, well, neither had I, and stuff. And, it's interesting because a friend of mine, Melissa Anderson, was a teacher at Union High School. Union High School is where Brittany went, and it's right next door to these apartments. And that's why I say we never heard about anything. And so a lot of people, found that odd. Well, that apartment complex started making a lot of changes after, a number of years where we kept complaining about things. And a student, when she was teaching a forensics class, and all the students made workbooks on her case. And he went up and took a picture, and they had put in some division. But if you think about it, I mean, one, they shouldn't have had the entry into the attic because nobody needed that necessarily. But if you think about it, wires for electricity are getting laid. When a place is built, they have all these common wirings and stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, it's something you don't even think of. And that's the scary thing is one, apartments don't have to tell you if anybody was assaulted. But two, safety factors, I could sit here and go, if only we had known that, and stuff. But and I don't even think Jeff was that familiar with it then. I think he was shocked by it, you know. So and that that's where we think possibly. I mean, they looked up there for stuff, and I don't know that they found any evidence or anything or uh, thumbprints or DNA or anything like that. But she also had a little balcony off of her apartment, and there were these two doors, and there was lattice on them. And once she locked herself out, and a friend of hers who was 6'3" hiked himself up onto the balcony and was able to sort of wedge the doors open so she could get in there to get her key, or he could unlock it for her. Of course, that guy was looked at later as a suspect. Um, but yeah, looked at later as a suspect. Um, you know, but yeah, it's crazy and stuff. But they did end up, fixing it. Of course, that didn't help us anymore. And so, somebody could have been waiting. Brittany was a fighter, and there were defensive evidence in the room. They spray that blue spray on stuff in a crime scene, and it was all over the wall and stuff. What I didn't know, which I wish I did, because that DNA from blood and semen was sent off to CC Moore in 2017, because they weren't doing the familial analysis for years. It was too shaky in court, and then they finally started doing it, and that DNA was sent off, and that's a whole nother story, but which really impacts the case. But what I didn't know, because after we can no longer use that DNA, and I'll tell you why in a minute, is there was defensive DNA underneath her nails, and why they didn't send that off first, I don't understand. It now is at a different company, but do you want me to tell you about the DNA?
I mean, if you can, or if you choose to.
I'm sorry?
I said it is completely up to you.
Oh, I I can talk about it. Well, and it's an important part of this case because we used it up till 2016 or 17 to compare against subjects. Jeff compared it to, like I said, 1,000 suspects at least, and every time it didn't match. So finally, I pushed and got the second detective, who is the one who started just shutting down communication, and then he retired and never got back in contact with me. I still have contact with everybody else. So CC Moore, I don't know if people have seen her, but there's a show called Finding Your Roots. And Finding Your Roots, the host is sometimes assisted by CC Moore. And CC Moore, just recently, about 2 months ago, I forget what the host name is, but she did his roots. Well, CC Moore also works with a group called Parabon. And Parabon is one of the first companies to develop a phenotype sketch. And some of you all may know, if you know the case, that we got a phenotype sketch made from the DNA. And from that, what they do is, and they've done a lot of testing to see if it works, but if the person is Eastern European, their forehead's going to be a certain way. If they have certain genes, then they're probably 80% have blue eyes and stuff. If they have certain genes, then they're Caucasian or Asian or whatever and stuff. And so, with blood and semen from the same person, we thought that's got to be the killer, except the semen was not found in her. And so they made a phenotype sketch. And it was this blonde haired, blue eyed guy, a bit age progressed and stuff. And with the picture, we started putting it out. And within 2 months, we had like 80 suspects. A lot of people were saying, that sort of looks like somebody I know who was abusive or who hurt somebody who was raped me or whatever and stuff. And so about a month after we did the picture, I got a call from Cece Moore, and she said, "Are you aware that your detective didn't want us to see if we could identify the DNA, do a familial type of search?" And I said, "No." And I got very upset, so I ended up calling him and pushing and pushing and pushing, and we got some funding. So for the next year and a half, she analyzed the DNA. And what you do when you're analyzing familial DNA, you start off, if you were visually seeing me, I'm starting off with my hands apart, but you start off with everybody in the world. And then certain DNA strands look a certain way if you're of a certain culture. And then if you're of a certain culture, let's say Eastern European, then you start narrowing it down more and more, and you start getting maybe to a 17th or an 18th relative, removed, somebody back in the old country or something. And then if you get more and more information as the databases are getting stronger, maybe you find uncle or something. And so a lot of the cases, like, there was a case in Sacramento with the San Francisco strangler who, a lot of times you might get a brother or something, and then maybe the brother ends up not being the killer, but then you find out that the brother of the brother, was somebody, but you usually don't get a direct hit. And so initially, after a year, Cece said she could only find somebody who was like a 17th relative, meaning the cousin of a 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 cousin. And so she said, I'm going to try some more databases because they were growing. And so I was on one of my caravans, which I can talk about later, but I was in Washington State and I got a call, and the detective said, "We have a direct hit." And I had been warned that we had a direct hit. Now, a direct hit does not mean a brother. A direct hit does not mean a father. A direct hit means the exact and only person who owns that DNA. That's the DNA match. It is a direct match. It can't be anybody else. It is only that person. And I went and I said, "Oh my God." And so I started thinking, oh, now we're going to have to go to court, and I'm scared about that and all these things. And his second sentence was, "But he's not our killer." And I felt like somebody had just told me Brittany died, because it went from, we've used this DNA for years, for more than 13 years, 14 years, to compare against suspects. And it meant we were going back to ground zero. That means every single suspect we had to look at again. And so I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, we went out and interrogated him, and he just didn't seem to be hiding anything. And then we talked to his ex-girlfriend and her father, and they both also said they don't think he was the killer. And plus, he has an airtight alibi." Of course, he wouldn't tell me what the airtight alibi was. And when he said the girlfriend and her father, was thinking, why would somebody be talking to somebody's father of an adult? Because this was, 13 years after the murder. So I knew who it was, because it was Brittany's best friend. And the reason I knew that is because her father was a Tulsa police officer, and this detective knew him and trusted his insight. He was also the person who, and I left this out, but what happened is a British friend that she went to school with came to her house Thursday and tried to see why she wasn't in school Wednesday. And something was strange with the apartment, so she called her dad. Her dad had called Tulsa police to do a wellness check. And when Tulsa police were called to do a wellness check, initially it was going to be my daughter's best friend's father, who she had gone to their house for the last 10 years. So he would have had to walk in on her. And so it didn't make sense to me, but all I knew is I had to get from Washington State back to Tulsa because they were going to break the news in about 2 days. And so I drove in 2 days back from Washington State to Tulsa. And so when I get there, Laurie Fulbright, look her up on Channel 6, CBS. She's been the crime reporter for 30 years. She and I talked about it and stuff. And I tried to say, well, what I asked the Tulsa police, well, should we do a joint news conference? They said, no. The detective said, no. I said, so what are you going to say? And he gave me some piece of paper that said, we're just going to say that we got a tip from the picture and it wasn't our killer. And that's what they said. But that's not what Laurie and I said. And I don't know, a lot of people, it took me years to understand DNA, but if you say you have a picture that's made from DNA and it's a white Caucasian young man and you got a tip from it and it's not the killer, then people are still thinking that DNA is valid versus CeCe Moore matched the DNA to its owner, so there can be no other person whose DNA it is, and he's not our killer. What that does, it says all those suspects, that look like that, it's not necessarily him. I really it's very hard to understand this sometimes. So if people don't understand that, do you guys, Devin, and do you all understand?
I'm up to speed.
Okay, because the problem is that that's when things started getting squirrely.
Yeah.
I started saying, so are we going back over all the old suspects? Because if that DNA that we used to compare all the suspects to is no longer valid because they're saying he's not our killer, then why are we not going back over all the old suspects? And they refuse to tell me if they did. They say we don't need to.
Okay, so I've got a question. If that DNA was eliminated, what DNA is the thoughts on lapses? What DNA are they working with?
Good question. And this goes back to me, excuse me, my language, but I wish I had known there was DNA underneath the nails because, I didn't know enough in 2004 to ask Jeff where it was all from, except, they told me about the blood and semen. But when we started sending off DNA, if I could see all the hands raised, how many people would think that you would send off the DNA underneath the nails first? Because that's defensive DNA. That is just crime scene 101, and so that is what Othram has. But here's the thing. In 2019, I did a podcast called With the Murder Squad, which one of the people, if people are into crime stuff, is Paul Holes. Paul Holes was part of that team, and they donated $6,000 for me to send more DNA off, and we were going to send it back to CeCe Moore. Except the Tulsa police would not let CeCe Moore talk to media. She was doing some ABC shows. She wanted to do our story on it because she said it's important to show how if you find DNA and you have no other evidence, and this is so important, you can't convict somebody. You can't use DNA without other evidence to convict. It's the same way you can find fingerprints, but if you can't have any other evidence. But they wouldn't send it back to her. And then Eddie Majors, it's the second detective, calls me. So we're at around 2022, I think. And he calls me because this all took 2019, 2021, and then COVID and everything. He calls me and he's supposed to be getting the papers together to be sent off to Othram. And he goes on a Friday, it was like August of 2022, I think. or maybe 21. It's too many years. And he calls me and he goes, I'm retiring this today, and you won't be able to contact me at this number. And pretty much left me in the lurch. I didn't know where the money that I had donated for the DNA analysis was. I didn't know what's going on. So I kept pushing and pushing. And finally, he said, well, we're sending it off to Othram. And then he retired. So I didn't know why. And I didn't know Othram. I do now, I do know their work and everything. And it took another 6 months. And I kept saying, can I get an update? They didn't assign another detective to the cold case. Tulsa's the second largest city in Oklahoma, and they only have one cold case detective, and they pull him off to work the current cases too. But I finally asked the deputy chief, because they were changing chiefs. I said, can I please have a meeting so I just know what's going on? And so finally in 2023, I get a meeting, and this is where they told me that it was sent off to Othram. But when I get this meeting, the deputy chief, who's now chief, sat there and said, and in this meeting is every single department head of Tulsa police. Plus, luckily, I was able to have my detective there. That used to be my detective. He wasn't anymore. But, and he goes, so, Dr. Zingman, you seem to have a problem with how we're doing the case. The floor is yours. And I almost started crying. I mean, that's how he introduced me to all these department heads who didn't know me, and introduced me to all these department heads who didn't know me. And, I said, I haven't criticized you. I just haven't, I don't know what's going on. I just wanted an update. And I just haven't, I don't know what's going on. I just wanted an update and stuff. And since that time, he's told his detectives he doesn't want his detectives talking to families because it takes away from the work. He's shut down communication with me. He won't let the detective respond to my calls, to my emails. So I've started just emailing and texting. It's crazy. But Othram has the DNA. And a lot of people will have a question about the trust he wasn't the killer, because it was my daughter's best friend's boyfriend. Initially, I didn't. But the blood and the semen was found on the sheet on her bed. She wasn't found on her bed, and the DNA was not found inside of her. We think there's a sample from inside of her, but we don't know where it is. And the blood was found in the bathroom on the wall. It was very minuscule. My daughter, being the typical 18-year-old who had a 17-year-old friend who had a cop as a father, allowed my daughter's best friend to sleep over there the weekend before she was murdered. And that's why his DNA was on the sheet. Did I believe that he couldn't be the killer? No, not initially. Believe that he couldn't be the killer? No, not initially. And so, I always had that question, because he could have been angry, he could have come back and stuff. I didn't think he could be the killer till they sent this DNA underneath the fingernails to Othram. And the only reason I know now, I'm pretty sure he's not the killer, is because to send off DNA to be analyzed, you make sure it doesn't match other profiles. That's why they knew the blood and semen were from the same person, because it was the same DNA strand. The stuff underneath the nails is no way matching the boyfriend's DNA. So they had to make sure it wasn't the same DNA before they sent it off. So I know that it's not him anymore, or at least, pretty sure. Defensive is going to be the killer. So does that make sense? Now, Othram's had it for a year. Now, DNA analysis is not like on TV. It can take a year to go down. Let's say, you get, like with him, you got Caucasian, and that's a really big database, because everybody does a lot of these databases now where they can opt in and stuff. And then there's CODIS, but there's CODIS, and then there's the military. They have DNA, but it's separate, and you have to get a court order to get any. I work with combat vets, and every single military member has to give their DNA in case they're blown up so they can be identified. The FBI has a separate DNA database. There's all these databases that should be communicating with each other, and they don't. But the Tulsa police, I went from having this dream team to now the sheriff of Tulsa County Sheriff, was my detective for 1 year between my best detective and the person who treated me badly. And the 1 year he was he said a couple of things to me. But he also said, if you ever need help, seek me out. Well, he has a cold case task force. This is Sheriff help, seek me out. Well, he has a cold case task force. This is Sheriff Vic Regalado. And on his task force is Mike Huff, ex-head of homicide, retired FBI, retired CIA, top forensic experts of bombings, of assaults. They have a great certified FBI established team, a cold case task force. Since 2020, they've been asking Tulsa police if they take a look at the case and help analyze it. And they kept saying no. And then in 2023, they came to a couple of meetings and pretended like they were going to help. And then all of a sudden in April 2023, they stopped. They said, nope, we're not going to do it. So I've been fighting and asking for the last 2 years for them to allow the sheriff's group to take the case and look at it. I've had Cheryl McCollum. I don't know if anybody knows Mac. Mac is part of, Crime Con, but more so Mac has the Cold Case Investigative Research Institute out of Atlanta, and look her up, Cheryl McCollum. She is just unbelievable, and she's got the Southern slang that just will rock your bottom, basically, she says. She's so funny, but she's offered to help. Well, this past Christmas, if you're in Tulsa, you might have heard this, Channel 6 did a story, and I said, I just want to ask Tulsa police, why won't they allow cold case assistance? I've been asking this since 2020, but definitely since up till 2023 when they dropped everything. And, whenever media does a story, they have to talk to somebody, somebody in TPD, and TPD usually won't say anything. They've refused to talk to a lot of national news that keeps asking them. But the reporter told me, oh, yeah, Lieutenant Watkins, who's over the cold cases and homicide, who's over homicide and cold cases, the department of that, he said he doesn't understand why you're asking it because he's never heard anything about any requests for cold case assistance. He was at the meetings with the sheriff's task force. And so a couple other times when I've said things and he's gotten on, and instead of going, well, I don't know if that's happening, we'll look into it like a good criminal justice department head would do. He sits there and has flat out called me a liar each time I've said something. Oh, that's not going on. But so this time they told me what they had already recorded him, and he said, I don't know what she's complaining about. We do everything, and she's never asked us. Well, God love Mac, because Mac has been offering help too. And she has been sending emails and stuff. And she got on with Channel 6 and she said, I don't know what he's talking about because we've been offering it since 2022. And I know the sheriff has too. Well, talk about communication shut down. Since that, they've really shut down, but they, it's just crazy, and stuff. And, there's two other things too, is, so we have the, we have, how I was notified that she was taken. When she was being buried, I wasn't allowed to see her because they told me that I shouldn't look at my child after she's been autopsied. Later in trainings, because I'm a psychologist, I train people that you've got to give families that, ability to make those decisions. But the thing is that, and this is just so confusing, I know, but in 20, I'm sorry, my voice is getting, I'm going to have to get a drink in a minute. In 2023, my ex-husband calls me. We divorced in 89 and had very little communication after the funeral. I paid for the funeral. He didn't come up for anniversaries. In my travels, he's never done a story with me. He calls up and he goes, I hope you won't be mad at me, but a couple of things. He had become Christian or something, or Catholic. He was converting or something. And he said, do you mind if we annul our marriage? I annulled it in my brain back in 89. But that being said, he said, but also I want you to look at something and don't be angry at me. And I said, okay. And I said, what am I looking at? And he said, look at that envelope. And so I looked at the envelope and I said, what? He said, look at the stamp. Now, I don't know how many people buy stamps out of a kiosk, but when you buy a stamp out of a kiosk, it comes either it prints on the envelope or it gives you this little white strip of paper. On that white strip of paper is the date and the time that you bought that stamp and what kiosk or whatever you bought it at. On that stamp, that he said he received this from my daughter 10 days after he got back from the funeral. And it was a birthday card that she always sent to her grandfather, but she never could remember his address, so she always sent it to her dad. And he said, I got this 10 days after I returned from the funeral, and I showed it to my grandpa, but then I put it in a box because it's the only thing I ever had of her. If people remember, I said the autopsy said she died sometime between September 27th at 9 p.m. when she called me and 8 a.m. on September 28th. The stamp was a day after that. A day after she was supposedly dead. So that means Wednesday or Thursday. So luckily, I have all this team. I have the sheriff. I have the retired head of homicide. I have FBI. I have Cheryl McCollum. I have two investigative reporters, Marion Roche and Andy Copsa, who have been in the field for 30 plus years. All of them behind the scenes helping me. So we started looking at it, and I said, send it to me. Don't send it to Tulsa police, because half the time I don't know if they get evidence. And so I got it, and I let the police know I had it. And so I said, then I was still living in Lawton. I'd come and stay at a hotel in Tulsa once a month. And I said, can you please come to the hotel and pick this up? Because it's a machine-made stamp. It's not where somebody did a stamp and then it went to the post office and they time and dated it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So, it could change the timeline. So they tell me, the detective told me, well, it's really hard for us to go out of the office because, we're understaffed. We have, sometimes it takes us a half an hour to get to call. Well, when they come to get this evidence from me, they have the head of homicide, my detective, and another detective with them. I don't know why they were so understaffed, but they sent all three people to it. And I said, well, I'm going to go to media. I'm going to do a story with media. So can we talk about what I'm going to say? And so the head of homicide, Lieutenant Watkins, goes, why do you need to go to the media? I said, that could hurt the case. I said, Well, here's the thing. Maybe she was always so busy. Maybe she gave somebody a card with her, grandpa's address on it. And she said, can you please mail this for me? And so somebody, maybe a day or two later, mailed it for her. And Lieutenant Watkins looked me in the eye and said, oh, come on. And actually, I had somebody on the phone listening to this. He said, oh, come on. How is somebody going to remember mailing something for somebody 20 years ago? And I looked him in the eye and I said, you know what? If I mailed something for somebody one day and 2 days later I hear on the news she was murdered, I'd remember it. So out of one side of the mouth, he's saying, oh, you can't share it with media because it's going to hurt the case. And the other side of the mouth, he says, nobody's going to remember it. It's not going to do anything. Well, I gave them that in February of 2023. April of 2023, the detective, I said, what are we doing with it? He said, well, we're going to send it off to the FBI. Since January even of 2023, they've never talked to my ex-husband about it, which that's where it came from. Every month and a half or so, I email them or leave a text. What's going on with that? They won't say anything about it. It's just so crazy, and people are trying to figure out what's going on. If it was just me, I think I'm just being oversensitive, but I have all these experts tell me something weird is going on. We don't know if it's because of the DNA or because they had a medical examiner who, before he was hired by Tulsa in 2003, 2002, he was fired in Arizona. He was also fired from Tulsa after Brittany's murder. Did it have anything to do with the murder? I don't know, but that in 2023, when we got that envelope, that's when we started looking at the medical examiner's report. And I mean, the case is, if people want to look at something that has a timeline, because I zig and zag all over the place, look up Andy Kopsa, Kopsa, Substack, and Brittany Phillips. If you put that in, and I'll try to post a link to it too, but that's how I get it. I go Andy Kopsa, ANDYKOPSKA, Brittany Phillips. It'll come up. But she and Laurie Fulbright, the CBS news anchor here in Tulsa, created a timeline, and that can, so they've had the DNA. I'm fearful. DNA, sometimes, if it's certain cultures, not all cultures, like Caucasians, will have as much representation in the databases, especially the familial databases. So, it's hard sometimes, because if they go through everything they have in those databases, they get at something called maintenance, meaning there's no new databases to run it against, so they just have to wait till something comes in.
What I will say is that with Othram having it does give me hope, because Othram has a 97% success rate. They have a better success rate than the Quantico headquarters of the FBI.
Right. But so does Parabon. Parabon is good too. Well, and I'm not, Othram and Parabon, neither of them can talk with me because they are hired by TPD. That's why when TPD told Cece Moore she couldn't talk about the DNA and couldn't have me on one of her shows to talk about it, she had to follow what they said. Othram can't talk to me, but let me tell you what they can tell me. So Othram and I and Cece Moore, Othram and I and Cheryl McCollum, God love her, when in Orlando at the Crime Con in 2023, Cheryl had me on her Friday night ride along. And this is where all the people at CrimeCon can come and help solve a case. Well, I was on stage with Othram and the caseworker and everybody, and they talked to me briefly, and they said, can you, when you talk to your detective, can you, or the old detective, she said, could you talk back to the old head of homicide, the old detective and stuff, and maybe ask them about certain cultures and some suspects of certain cultures, because that would help us, because maybe they've narrowed it down some, it's not all the people in the world, maybe it's one or two or three different cultures. And so when they're starting to narrow it down like that, if the police have some suspects where they don't have to keep analyzing it because they get a direct match, that's great. So I said, yeah. So I called them and stuff, and about a week later I was home from CrimeCon, and I called the caseworker, and I said, you know what? I talked to Jeff Felton, I talked to Mike Huff, I talked to Vic Regalato, I talked to Jeff Felton, I talked to Mike Huff, I talked to Vic Regalato, I talked to all the old detectives, and they said they were more than willing to give you some names of people to look at and stuff. And then Mike, the caseworker with Othram, all of them are so great, but he said, well, I'd love to talk to them, but the Tulsa deputy chief said that we can't talk to any of the old detectives. We can't talk to the old head of homicide. We can't talk to anybody but the current cold case detective, which is ridiculous, because a lot of times it's the retired detectives who don't have the crunch of the job anymore, who have ideas about the case. Then Mike Nance, who also was a detective during that time, who has worked with NamUs, went and worked with Othram too. He came when he was working with them, tried to talk to the cold case detective to get him to look at some of these populations, some of the suspects, because he remembered some suspects that might be good. Didn't get anything. Why would a police department say, don't talk to the old detectives? So Othram's running into some roadblocks too. We've talked about some ways around it. But so, unfortunately, I've heard some rumors that they asked Tulsa police to run some things, and they haven't always done that. So yes, Othram is great. The problem is Tulsa police, and why will Tulsa police not allow anybody to talk to the old detectives? That is just, that's crazy.
Pathetic is what it is. Just like them not wanting to bring in some of these outside agencies that are offering their assistance. I'll never understand that. When you've got a case that is 20 years old, you should appreciate any help from any outside agency in order to try to solve it.
I know, and it's crazy. I mean, I don't know how many people know about me, but you see that picture flashing there as I'm talking? I have been doing my Caravan to Catch a Killer tours since 2007. And I have covered over 300,000 miles through 48 states on 23 tours. And almost every city that I go to, I talk to as many police as I can and detectives and stuff. And all of them, I remember I was in Santa Fe and somebody said, God, we would just jump, at the offer of it. Most say, we're understaffed, we're underfunded, of course. Plus you have the sheriff's cold case task force who has all these retired TPD who already know the case. But Tulsa police, well, one, I don't know why they acted like they were going to do it and then decided not and stuff. And then they said, well, and even if we did, they can only come in and look at the case on our computers for a couple hours. I've talked to a lot of cold case, including Cheryl McCullum's Cold Case Investigative Research Institute, who's just a great group. You all need to look her up too. The sheriff has a center in downtown Tulsa near the OSU building that is FBI protected. That all the computers are so, you know, secure, and most police departments always allow that to happen. We have a commissioner, and I was talking to the commissioner who's been elsewhere in other states before, and she said, yeah, it's very rare, one, that a city would refuse, the city police would refuse assistance, and then two, that even if they did, that they wouldn't allow access. I mean, you know, Tulsa has been sued a couple of times for lost evidence. I mean, if they haven't done anything wrong, they're creating this.
I'm just going to put it out there that nothing you say about the Tulsa Police Department is going to shock me. Having covered cases as many years as I have, and having worked with as many families as I have, but I will say this. Refusing outside assistance is not isolated to the Tulsa PD.
Oh, no, I know.
Surprised how many families I've dealt with all throughout the United States where additional assistance is offered, and I think it's one of the things where the local police departments are afraid to accept help from outside agencies because it makes them look bad in their eyes because they weren't able to solve the case.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing is, you know, and I present, I'm 70, I'm crazy. I've presented all over the country because of my expertise in trauma and what people bring to the event, but also because I'm a psychologist, I'm a survivor and a homicide survivor, and I've been on a lot of panels and stuff. And yes, there are a number of cities who don't want to look bad, but there's also a number of people who understand that, you know, and that's what I say to Tulsa police. I said, it's, you know, if nothing else, they confirm what you already know, you know, and stuff. And you know, more and more, like Fort Worth, they just finally fought at City Hall, and it's what I'm going to hope to do too, is to get, you know, this is criminal that, you know, we have one cold case detective for the second largest city. You know, OSBI up in Oklahoma City has a cold case task force that they allow people to bring it in. And that's where, here's the thing. For the first 10 years, the team I had, whenever I was traveling and I would hear all these horror stories that you're talking about, I would go, oh my God, you know, I feel bad because, you know, I had the team that taught me everything I know, and that, you know, Jeff would call me up every time we got a suspect, and then he called me up every time it didn't work out, you know, and then, you know, I'd never thought I'd have the same story as many of these people. So yeah, that's part of my mission now on my caravans. Is it used to be just to, you know, solve her crime, but for the last 10 years, it's been trying to give cold case families a voice and bring things up and find the families who are not, you know, getting what they should. And so a lot of states, and this is another problem, a lot of states have been working, they have a federal Homicide Survivors' Rights Act, but it's only for federal cases, meaning county cases or OSBI. It's not city cases. So I'm going to be working hopefully with Ross Ford. He sort of has said he's interested in this, on getting an Oklahoma Homicide Survivors' Rights Act, because Kelsey's Law does some things, but it doesn't really cover what is needed. And we need something that shakes up the cities, because they get out of it because they're not in that county loop or the sheriff's loop or the state troopers loop, you know. So, but how are we doing on time? I thought we were only going to do it till 10. I mean, I'm able to go on, but I have been going on and on.
I mean, I'm doing good on time. How's everybody else?
I'm fine.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Yeah, I think we're
Well,
pretty
I mean,
open on time right now.
I mean, there's so many twists and turns, that, are there any specific questions or anything you want to
Well,
know
I had
more
to step
about?
away when you talked about the letter, the
So,
the letter with the post stamp on it.
right.
I had my daughter woke up, so I had to tend to her. I
Oh,
didn't hear what had happened.
well, just briefly.
Happened.
Well, just briefly, it was a letter that my daughter would send every year to her grandfather, but she could never remember his address and stuff. And my ex didn't tell me till 2023 that he had gotten it 10 days after she was murdered. And the big thing about this envelope is that there's a difference between this envelope that's stamped and then you put it at the post office and they time date it. They do that little circle cancellation and stuff. But this, if at a stamp at a kiosk, is it either prints the date and the stamp on the envelope or it gives you a white piece of paper that has the time, the date, the kiosk address on it. And so it's not something that if it's sitting, somebody mailed it and it's sitting in a box and it's canceled, the stamp is made when somebody's mailing it. And that stamp was dated 2 days after they say she died. 1 or 2 days. I'm being a little bit vague about it, but so.
Yeah, my understanding from what I was reading was it was the 30th, and they said that she died sometime between the 27th and the 28th.
Right. Yeah. And so and then like I said, when we got this and there's a possibility that, her time of death could be wrong. When I did finally go to the media, even though, the head of homicide said, "Oh, you don't need to go to media. Nobody's going to remember, and it'll hurt the case, or it won't hurt the case because it won't matter." But when I did go to media, there was a couple of people who said, "I thought I was crazy. I thought I saw her after that day, and." But I just thought, oh, I'm just devastated. So that's why I thought I saw her. So, and, I told everybody to call the detectives and stuff. And when I told people to call the detectives in the first 10 years, they would tell me, yeah, we got that tip. I have, and it's sort of why I was saying to you, I'll put my email on there too, because there's no hurt in them telling me that they got a tip, but they don't. It's almost like it's punitive for a number of reasons that they won't communicate with me at all. But that, like I was saying too, with that time, when you start looking at the medical examiner's report, the way the food looked, I think I said earlier that it looked like she had just eaten a Big Mac or something. And, when you decompose and stuff, there's a process that happens. But, there was just so many things in the medical examiner's report that are questionable, and they've never looked at any of that. They've never called him, which is just crazy. Did that sort of fill it in a little bit?
What was that?
Did that sort of fill it?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that was the only question I had.
I don't know if most people are listening in Tulsa, but there's going to be another crime con in Denver, and I would have never gone to these things until they started sharing my story. And also they're donating a table so I can have a table with all my information and everything. And that's going to be September 3rd, 4th, and 5th. But before that, I'm going to be doing my 24th caravan out probably up to the Wisconsin and then over to, through the north and western states before I get back to Denver. So, probably Montana, Wyoming, maybe Washington, although I heard they just had snow in their mountains today, which is crazy.
So I guess the only question that I can think of as of right this second is, like, do you believe, like, with that letter, do you believe that your daughter mailed that out or somebody else?
I don't believe she necessarily mailed it. Is that what you asked? Because the word sort of went. Yeah. I think maybe she asked somebody to mail it for her, but I can't make that assumption. I mean, it could be that, she, mailed it herself. I mean, we just don't know. That's why we need people to look at the medical examiner report. We need to look at the evidence that's still in the evidence room and stuff.
And then, like, she didn't have any enemies or anything, right?
Well, I mean, here's the thing is we use that DNA of blood and semen to compare to all the old boyfriends, to old, people. There was a guard, and this story's been told a lot, but there was a guard that was walking around the mall that was near her apartments, and he was acting like he was part of the case. And so some of the women who were working at the mall called the detective and said, "This is really bizarre, he looks, is he with the case?" And he wasn't. He was a security guard. He ended up having tried to contact Brittany, and his name was in her phone and stuff. And, but the DNA of blood and semen didn't match him. But that's where we get back to this thing about when they're saying that it was a tip from the picture versus C.C. Moore made a match to the DNA,
real quick, is the blood your Brittany's or the suspect?
No, it's the suspects.
Okay, all right.
It's DNA from the suspect, both blood and semen from the same suspect.
Okay, all right.
And stuff. And so, but the thing is that because Tulsa police didn't say that that happened, people still think, it's the white Caucasian boy. But it's not. And so why aren't we, that person who was acting like he was part of the case, his DNA was compared to the blood and semen. And of course it didn't match,
Yeah, but it needs to be re-compared to the defensive DNA under the fingernails.
Exactly. But, ARP1, exactly. But, ARP1, our Tulsa police doing that, because every time I ask, the deputy chief, who's now chief, goes, "You weren't doing what we're supposed to. You don't need to know that information," which that's not how I was treated the first 10 years, and stuff. And, I think they're waiting for me to die, really, to tell you the truth. I'm 70, and nobody can understand why they're doing this. But that's why, that's actually, that suspect could really fit the profile. And that's why we've been trying to go back, and why OSRAM has been trying to say, we need you to look at some of these people. And as far as I know, because nobody can tell me except some people behind the scenes are telling me, is, Tulsa police won't answer those questions, and which then makes you think, what did they do wrong? But here's the thing. If anybody out there knows anybody in national media, nothing's going to shake Tulsa police, and it's true about any city. Your local media has to maintain some level of communication with the Tulsa police. With any, I don't even want to say Tulsa, any city, your media has to maintain some communication. So they can only push so far, or then they shut down all communication with media. So the only people who can really rock the tree, and it's usually when something happens, is when national news looks into some of the local police stuff. And that's been the weirdest problem of mine, is I only recently got true crime news story because somebody has just been fighting and fighting for me. Um, Polly Katowski actually was part of the group that gave us the $6,000 to send off to Othram, and she was writing for True Crime Dollars to send off to Othram, and she was writing for True Crime News, which didn't get reconnected for next year. But but every time I get national news, the story goes away, which is again weird. you know. So it's just, I mean, anybody listening to me would think I'm crazy, by all these things that I'm saying, but I wish I was making it up, and I wish all my team behind the scenes didn't agree with me that this is crazy. Yeah.
Oh, I don't think it's crazy at all. I think that you are a mother that's fighting for justice for her daughter, and that not only are you a great advocate for her, but for other families that are going through the same type of situation.
Yeah, well, that's how you survive. And even though I take her back in a minute, I mean, the gifts that I've had from being on the road as much as I have, and meeting people like you, and just so unbelievable that in some ways I've had experiences that other people will never have. And I mean, I would trade it all in for her, but I have to sort of appreciate the gifts amid the losses, they say, if that makes sense.
Oh, it does. It does. And I can guarantee you, she is looking down from heaven and smiling down on you, just beaming with pride with how hard you're fighting for her.
Well, she would do the same for me. I mean, she was an advocate always, She was like a mini me, so she'd be doing the same thing, I'm sure. So.
You chime in and say the same. You are an amazing advocate for her.
Well, I always just say to people, and I really don't mean this in a demeaning to myself way, but I'm just a mother, and the thing is, I say that because I've met so many people who are mothers, and it's like, I learned early on, I learned that if I crumble, then her memory crumbles. And then two, I'm a very conceited, loving mother who, I now know, probably 500,000 people know my daughter now, so I love the fact that she's known. So, all those things keep me going and stuff. But I appreciate what you say. But again, I have no choice. Yeah.
But Maggie, was she cremated?
No. So, okay, there may be a little bit of a noise here because I got 4 wild ones which are wanting to go out. So, hold on one second. It's going to be a mad dash. Boom, boom. Okay. So, Brittany, I was raised Reformed Jewish, and that basically means you're like a Buddhist or something. It's more philosophy than anything else. So when you're buried in a Jewish burial, you're not cremated, but you're also not, what's the
Embalmed.
word? Yes, thank you. My brain just went dead. You're not embalmed and stuff. So, the whole crazy thing is that, just a little side story is, we had no plans to bury either her or me, or her brother. And so that weekend when my parents came in, we bought the plot. we bought, the casket and all those things. And that's when the funeral director wouldn't let me see her. I didn't have a voice back then. But then I discovered in 2009 when somebody donated money for the God Beautiful headstone and bench that I have now. And when they were plotting it out to set it, all of a sudden the funeral company, funeral home said to me, or the cemetery said to me, "Are you aware that she's buried in the wrong place?" And I said, "What?" They said, "Yes, she was supposed to be here, but she was buried in the area that was supposed to be delegated for a path through the cemetery." That was in 2009. She was buried in 2004. When I told my dad, who was living then, about this, he said, "You know what? The day of the funeral, you kept saying that's not where we were going to bury her." And he said, "I thought you were just overwrought and stuff and just upset about it. And so that I never thought twice about it." So I ended up finding out that a group called, and if people want to look up another weird thing, a group called Service Corporation International was a cemetery and cremation company all across the U.S. that started having class action lawsuits against me, all across the U.S. that started having class action lawsuits against it back in the late 1999 and 2000 and stuff, at places like Arlington Cemetery, 2 or 3 Jewish cemeteries in Florida and stuff. And so they had to sell some of their cemeteries and embalming place, or the places that do the other way, and stuff. And so what I learned was Service Corporation International owned Rose Hill Cemetery in 2004, and they were forced to sell it to somebody else. But so when she was buried in the wrong place, which is not a full-size hole in the ground, it was an area that was going to be for a path. All these stories about Service Corporation International, about them laying caskets on top of caskets, non-embalming people, stuff being stolen. I mean, I almost had, stuff being stolen. I mean, I almost had to disinter her, or whatever it's called, when I learned that. I mean, it was just, injury to injury and stuff. So, but why did you ask if she was?
Because I was thinking about under her nails, like they could check that with her, like
That's the DNA that's at Othram now.
Oh, okay.
But the whole thing is that, they possibly told me, but why when we first sent, they held off till 2017 to get the DNA analyzed, because, it was so new with familial that people were losing cases in court. And what I've learned is, you have to be careful about using something new too quickly, because you can get a case thrown out, if it hasn't been tested in court. And now it has been. Even the Supreme Court has said that DNA is no more than electronic fingerprints and stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's been 20 years, so how much is left?
I know.
Except nails, but there was that DNA, that's the whole thing. No, Bree, no. I don't know why I have 4 children. It's because 2 of them were foster fails, and I just couldn't give them up. So one's 3 and the oldest is 17. So anyway.
Oh wow.
But they keep me occupied, so to speak. But is there anything else you want to know? Any questions or anything?
I think Marcella had a question earlier. It said, "Have you
Oh, it
reported it to
was
the
if
FBI?"
you've contacted the FBI.
Yeah.
Well, so here's the thing. OSBI, or whatever the state is, has connections to the FBI. The problem is, and like I said, I have Sam Carlson is retired FBI, and I just met with him and Mike. They're on the sheriff's cold case task force, and so we've talked about the FBI. But the problem is that if Tulsa doesn't ask them into the case, they can't come in. Now, Sam has tried to find some avenues of ways that we might be able to. So one of the things that we looked at one point was the suspect that we were looking at when we thought it was the boyfriend. Was he Native American? Because the McGirt case would mean that we could get it looked at through the county, but he wasn't. And the current other DNA, and the current other DNA, I need to ask about that, because nobody knows, although some people do, but nobody really knows what that DNA is. I mean, I have a little bit more information than some people, but it's not our white Caucasian boy. But like I said, before they get DNA sent off to somebody else to analyze, they have to make sure it doesn't match to the other profiles. And that's why, they had 6 profiles right after the murder, and 2 of them matched the blood and semen. So, and a couple of the other ones are mixed DNA, meaning they couldn't fully identify one person now, so they've been analyzing that. But it's like, so if we're at maintenance now, meaning that they can only go so far with the database on the current DNA at Othram, why aren't they sending off the other profiles? And I keep asking that question, but they refuse to answer anything. And I was told about 4 years ago, well, we don't respond to you because you write too often and you write too long. So about 4 years ago, I started writing once every month and texting and making it shorter, and they still don't respond. It's sort of like an abusive husband that says, if you just didn't do this, I would be better. It's just crazy. But I'm pushing and pushing and trying to find some national reporter to look into this, and I'm trying to talk to lawyers. I mean, a FOIA is not going to really help me, but there are some cases in Tulsa where they fought to get the case files, away from
Yeah, they'll
Tulsa.
keep the case open for as long as they can just to keep you from doing a FOIA on it.
Well, that's the interesting thing is mine's cold cases, because I've worked with a couple of PD panels and investigator panels and stuff, and they'll just run one sample out somewhere, and then they'll say, well, we can't talk on it because it's still, we're actively investigating it. Can't talk on it because it's still, we're actively investigating it. And that's what the few times that they've been willing to talk to media, that's what they've told them, and stuff. Or they've just lied that, media, that's what they've told them, and stuff. Or they've just lied that, we're communicating with her all the time. Well, so, I mean, but the good thing is I did have a meeting with the mayor and commissioner, and Tulsa Police knows that, and there's a lot of issues going on. So
come in on this case because I think that they could benefit from an FBI profiler putting together a profile of the person that
No,
they
of course.
benefited this
Yeah,
from.
you're talking about people who are refusing cold case help. Yeah, no. Back when Jeff was my detective, we had a profiler, and she came up with some good things. And, it never got us anywhere, but she did some good stuff. Well, Sam has profiled before, and Sam's retired FBI, and stuff. And so he's on the sheriff's task force. The problem is they're not allowed to look at the case books.
I know.
And their analysis is, we've gotten the general analysis. They still have that, but they don't. But it's the particulars that start making the profile interesting, and because they can't go back on that. Jeff is great at remembering everything, but, because he can't get to the files, he used to let me come in. In 2009 and in 2012, before he left, I went in and looked at these big stacks of, the case files and stuff, and was able to give him a couple of ideas. And all the best practices, all the research, says when you have a relationship with family, a lot of times that's how you solve a case, because suddenly a family's not sitting there going, why won't anybody talk to me? They're just more relaxed and stuff. I mean, all the research shows that, but Tulsa doesn't care. And it's because they're run by somebody who, and I don't care if he's listening, because they tell me they listen to everything I do. They treat the families like they're the enemies. And, the example of how he introduced me to his team when I hadn't done anything, And again, if it was just me, I've worked with families where they're just angry about everything. If it was just me complaining, then I think I'd finally catch on that I was just, angry about everything. If it was just me complaining, then I think I'd finally catch on that I was just, just being angry all the time. But when I have a retired FBI, when I have the retired head of homicide, when I have my detective, when I have the top crime reporter, and Fox 23, Shay Rozzi and Lori Fulbright have been behind the scenes for years. When they're telling me, no, you're not crazy, this is going on,
Well, I mean, they've mishandled this case from day one, in my opinion, just simply because the DNA that they should have gathered and started testing immediately was what was underneath the nails. That the defense.
Okay, but here's the thing: they took scrapings underneath the nails. They took scrapings vaginally and elsewhere. But you have to understand. Yeah, but no. But in 2004, they didn't have that analysis you're talking about. In 2004, OSBI, when they were running a sample of DNA that they had to try to identify, they had to wait till they got 30 other samples, because it was so expensive to run that machine that they had to wait. It cost me $6,000 to send off the DNA, and stuff. And then too, in 2004, the only DNA they had was in CODIS. In CODIS, the only DNA was from convictions. There was no such thing like DNA at arrest. So they were sending it up in CODIS every 2 weeks for the first 8 years. And they could, hopefully they're continuing to do that. But they didn't have any of those analysis. We kept trying to get familial DNA when it was just starting to be used. So that's the problem, is that once we started analyzing to be used. So that's the problem, is that once we started analyzing it, that's where I believe in 2012 they started making the mistakes. Because, Eddie Majors is the one who made the decision to send it off. And he sent off the blood and semen. And then, so that's the thing, that's the hard thing, is a lot of this was not around back then. We didn't have the ability to do that.
I get that. technology is always changing. I remember when you had to have such a large sample just to be tested, and now they can test a minute sample of DNA, and they're able to separate profiles from each other if it's a mixture of
Yeah,
DNA.
that's why they're doing now. We initially had mostly mixed and that's why in 2023, because I travel a lot, I'm talking to all the top DNA people. That I went into that meeting and said, "Are we using touch DNA? Are we using the MVAC? Have we gone back over old evidence?" "Oh, Dr. Zingman, you don't need to know that. We're doing what we're supposed to." That's not the answer you give me, and stuff. And so I think they've lost evidence, but I think they've also made some mistakes somewhere after 2012, but like you said, I mean, that's the same thing. It used to cost so much to run a big batch of DNA. I used to know the head of the forensics up at OSBI, and we would always talk about that, and that's what created a lot of the backlogs in the rape kits too, because they just, and that's what they try to use against us, on passing DNA to arrest. Well, it's so costly. I say, guess what? The studies show once you start doing it, your criminal justice departments start making more money because they're not having as many cold cases anymore because they're taking the DNA at arrest and getting criminals off the street earlier. It's crazy, but I've seen both sides of it. So that's the problem, is that ever since we started making changes with DNA is when I had the bad crew start taking over.
Well, you're by
Hey
far
guys,
not the only person that I've talked to that's had a bad experience with the people that are currently working at the Tulsa PD.
Well, yeah. So if I sat here and thought it was only me, then I'd be pretty ignorant. I mean, that's one thing. That's If it was just me, then I wouldn't have any complaints. But the problem is all my motivation is, if they're doing it to me, I can handle it. But they're not just doing it to me; they're
Oh,
doing it to everybody else. And I've always operated under that, because it doesn't matter if something's just happening to me. But I think early on, especially when I started traveling, I was traveling because I knew it was happening to other people. I knew just cold case issues were happening, and stuff.
yeah, I was actually just in Tulsa this afternoon to meet with the mother of a person that was murdered in Tulsa, or I believe was. She's classified as missing, but in all likelihood, she's no longer with us. And so I've been helping her for the past several months, and I went up there to meet with her today and go take a look at the property that she had at the time that this took place and everything.
hey guys, real quick. Munchie. If
Huh?
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot I was up here. Yeah, I've been so intensely listening that I forgot I was in a box.
Oh no, you're okay. Just real quick, I can't remember right off the top of my head, but at the bottom of our flyer where it says "Scan Me," where exactly does that take us?
The Facebook page.
Okay,
Yeah. And the reason I have that is because I have a website that I've used forever, but when it changed, whoever's running the whatever it's called, I haven't been able to really fix it much. So most everything I'm getting is on Facebook till I, change that. And so I'm always on there, and I do lives on there too and stuff. And so that's why we decided to do that.
Yeah,
okay, yeah,
Maggie,
that's fine. I wanted to double check to make sure where that would take us.
yeah, I had spoken with Maggie about that, and I'm glad you went there. And also, I told you that or I had mentioned to you that if you needed help with the website, I can help you out with that.
Yeah. Well, I'm probably going to take you up on that.
Okay. All right. Cool. And by the way, it's nice to meet you finally.
Yeah, it is.
We've both determined that we're both weird.
Everybody's weird.
You're right.
Well, my famous thing with, it is, as a psychologist, like, what is normal? Normal is, one person in a large convention. There's no such thing as that. We are human beings, so we're all just, who we are.
Yes. Well, I hope you get some answers
Absolutely.
very soon.
Absolutely.
I mean, especially with having DNA, it floors me that they have DNA and that person is not a match. That just floors, or not. I mean, they're not considering him a suspect. That floors me. I mean, I thought DNA was.
Say that again.
I'm just confused as to why they had DNA. They got a match, and they're saying he's not a suspect.
Well, because DNA doesn't necessarily mean a person is guilty. And there was no other evidence to point at that point, although they didn't tell me everything because that's when they started not communicating. Mm-hmm. So that's when there just wasn't a lot of evidence. And it's a good thing that you can't just convict with DNA, and stuff. And so, but until I knew of the DNA underneath the nails, and until I knew that it didn't match him, it's not the same person, it did not match, that because the DNA underneath the nails did not match him, because to send it off, they have to make sure it doesn't match something you've already identified. That's where, unless somebody was there with him, there's no evidence at this point to say that, but never say never, that since it didn't match him, the DNA underneath the nails is most likely our killer.
Yeah.
So does that make sense? That's why, I mean, in my mind and in many people's mind, the other one still was a suspect, even though he had an alibi, but we didn't have any evidence. And if you try to convict somebody without any evidence and you lose the case, then you lose the suspect. So meanwhile, we were all trying to find evidence. But when I learned about the DNA underneath the nails, I didn't know what the other 4 profiles were, because Eddie wouldn't tell me after, Jeff left. But when I learned it wasn't the same person, I'm pretty secure that. So, that's the thing. And it confuses a lot of people because DNA started off being taken after somebody was convicted. People always associate guilty and DNA, and that's not true. It's that DNA is just an identifier. The only reason that they started taking it at conviction at first was just so if they ever got out and committed more crimes, you would know who they were. But then they learned, oh, okay, now we're convicting somebody and we're matching his DNA backwards over 20 years to all these rapes, and study after study was showing that. And then they started saying, hey, maybe if we take it at arrest and after 3 rapes we see the same person, then we have evidence to convict them. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
I mean, it took me years to understand it, but I had to because I was going into lawmakers and they wanted to say, oh, DNA means a person is guilty before they're innocent. And we'd have to go, no, it's just because we took it when they were guilty. But, I mean, it's hard to understand. But, again, if we hadn't have had the DNA underneath the nails, but there's, but the fact that they won't tell me, if they've used, MVAC. MVAC can look at material now and get DNA that we couldn't even imagine getting in 04 or 05 or 06 or 07. And why they can think that all they have to tell me is we're doing what we're supposed to, And that's the thing, is it's not me just asking the questions. All the people on Cheryl's cold case team, Cheryl, all the people on Vic Regalato's cold case task force, Mike, Sam, the FBI, all the people, Dr. Beeman, who's head of forensic at OSU, they're all asking the same questions I am. So that means if they could get hold of the case, they could answer these questions. But Tulsa police won't allow it. So I'm going to probably be putting up a billboard that says, "What would it hurt? Why won't Tulsa police allow cold case help?" And put it right on 244.
There you go.
Yeah. Expensive, but, you know, Lamar Billboard put up a billboard for me in 2007 through 2009, and some of the same people are still there, so I may be able to get a discounted price, you know, and stuff.
Yeah, Lamar's a great company. I've done a lot of work with them on billboards for missing families. So.
Yeah, they are. I mean, I just couldn't believe. And then, you know, if anybody ever wants a rap, Travis Hermanza, I never pronounce his last. If anybody ever wants a rap, Travis Hermanza, I never pronounce his last name right, but he's the owner of Midwest Raps, and he's wrapped all 5 of my cars. And I found him in '07 because after we had like 800 suspects, I thought, you know, I need to get my story across the country, and maybe a detective will have a similar story, because there's not a lot of communication across departments. I mean, there is, but there isn't. And so I saw this beautiful truck wrapped, and I left a note on it and said, you know, could you, you know, tell me where you got this? And then he ends up emailing me back or calling me and saying, you know, I own Midwest Wraps, and I actually have a wrap school, which is no longer there, with Feller's Vinyl. And Feller's is going to donate the wrap material, and I'll do the artwork. So can you get me some pictures? And that was our first generation wrap, which has changed so much from what's on there now. But he's always, you know, somebody's always donated some money to it, or he has, you know, and, you know, it's been a moving billboard. And that's the crazy thing, is every time I travel, and over 300 local reporters in all the 48 states have done stories, and they say to me, oh, come on now, I bet National News has done a story on the caravan, haven't they? National News has never picked up, and I've never heard of any other person self-funding 300,000 miles through 48 states on soon-to-be 24 tours. I mean, I would live without heat or air conditioning or food, or a water heater broke in my Chandler house, the house that I bought right before Brittany was killed. I would live without stuff, you know, and I was working, so I'd work overtime just so I could do the caravans. Yeah, it's crazy. Anyways.
I do apologize about everything you have had to gone through, and you deserve answers and closure.
Well, no, there's no such thing as closure. You know, I always say that to people, because closure means, well, if just this and this happens, I'll feel better. And I always say, and I sort of said this at the beginning, but it's sort of a good closure type of statement. There's no such thing as closure. What you have to do is, because you thing is closure. What you have to do is, because you've had the loss, but you have to learn how to live in spite of it, because of it, and in honor of it. And because, you know, I'm waiting for, if only we find the killer, I'll feel better. If only we get them off the street. If only I know if they're dead or alive. If you do that, then you live in these if-onlys, and it really doesn't allow you to live. So you have to live, well, like I said, learn how to live with it, in spite of it, and because of it. You know, you have to learn how to live every day, because, you know, I'm not going to let her killer take my life. And you do me wrong, you make me a fighter, and I have fun getting back at you.
But I do hope you get answers, at least.
Well, I appreciate it. Well, every time somebody does something like this gift, it makes me think, it makes other people think, it's just, it's great. And I would love for people, if nothing else, to just message me or, underneath the promo that we had for this, just say that they were on this live because, I'd love to, meet more people and hear their stories.
Absolutely. I mean, we can kind of go through one person at a time, kind of tell a little bit about each other. I'll go first. I originally started my TikTok platform about 5, 6 years ago. Originally, I would just come on like every now and then, post silly TikTok videos. Um, and then my mother began to go missing a couple of years ago. So when that first started happening, I brought to TikTok her case to talk about her case details, share some flyers, just get any and all information that I possibly could. Um, I was under the impression that she was found um, sometime last year, so that's when it was originally Find Catherine Stonewall, but then we generated from Find Catherine Stonewall into Devin and the Missing. And then we started covering, we probably now cover 14 or 15 cases. I got to double count.
Wow.
14 or 15 cases. I got to double count.
Wow.
But somewhere around there. And once we started covering our cases and some time had gone by, a certain situation back in January had happened with my mother's Facebook account. And then that's when I did learn that she was listed as a missing person once again. She hasn't been located since. But I understand what that kind of pain is like. And ultimately, at the end of the day, me, myself, and I, like, I truly believe that it is very good to have somebody on your side that can fully relate on the things that you are facing, the feelings that you are feeling, and so on and so forth. But Ruth, do you want to kind of talk a little bit about yourself?
Okay, so the reason why, when I first got on this app, I followed a lady named Nina Glass. And then I went and I came across Devin and she offered me a mod position. And so I started doing that, and I keep up with a lot of different cold cases. I've looked into a ton of different things, but yeah, that's something I help like work on cases and do stuff like that.
That's great.
Yep.
Munchie?
I'm just a graphic designer.
Just
No, I fell into this kind of by accident. I was helping somebody. How do I say this? I was helping somebody. How do I say this? I was moderating for somebody that was helping the homeless in Arizona, and we would have a lot of people coming in that children or a missing loved one. And they thought that they were homeless living out in Arizona. And it just like I said, I got into this by accident and started making flyers for missing people. And it just kind of blossomed from there. I have a graphic design background. Oh my gosh, 1995. I've had my business. And I just, I do this out of the goodness of my heart because I want to help find missing people. I want to help find, like your daughter, get the word out there, bring awareness, and that's my ultimate goal, is just to get awareness, closure. Well, you don't like the word closure, but kind of closure for families. Um, so that's basically. I'm not an investigator, but I am a graphic designer. So that's where I'm at.
And
Well,
she is very much appreciated.
yeah, and we're all investigators of a sort,
Hmm
and stuff.
I mean,
Yeah,
ultimately, at the end of the day, like I tell everybody all the time, is that multiple heads are a lot better than one.
Of
yeah,
course.
yeah.
I.e., Tulsa police used cold case help.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and this
Uh,
isn't the first time that we've run across Tulsa Police Department, like Arctic said.
right.
Yep.
Thank you, Munchie. Marcella, do you want to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Maricela. I'm dealing with my son being taken into Mexico. He's been kidnapped into Mexico by his father, and I'm dealing with having to have Mexico, the court, and Interpol find him and locate him so I can go and get him. Um, it's just it's been 2 years since I seen my son.
And is Interpol helping you?
Right. I do have the FBI now on the case, but it's since the riots. I don't know what's
Yeah,
going
I
on.
know. I know. Well, and that's an issue too, is with the missing and with a lot of the Juarez cases and stuff. There's a lot of it's very hard to get the cross slash country interaction and stuff. And where are you living? Are you where are you now?
California.
Okay, like Southern California, or
Yeah.
okay, yeah. I mean, and so are you part of any missing groups?
N- no.
The only reason I ask that is sometimes, just having, well, a couple of things. Have you heard of NamUs?
I did went on their website and I
Yeah.
did fill out on their website, fill out a form, but they haven't gone back to me. So
I know some people on there. I may see if I can connect them. But yeah, because it's just not only in them helping identify, but they've got a lot of support systems. And usually, like here in Oklahoma, we just did a twice yearly type of meeting of getting more families who just recently had somebody taken or missing and stuff, and getting them to get resources. So sometimes beyond just going to their site, if you can find what the local name is. Usually there's, some of the major cities have a local group and stuff, and they usually have a lot of resources, whether it's counseling or support, or especially in California, they probably maybe have some people who are dealing with the cross country border, issues and stuff. So, but contact me on the Facebook, and I can see if I can connect you to some people that might be able to help.
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Unfortunately, I've been doing this long enough that I've been around a lot of these groups. I actually trained with NamUs in Albuquerque in 2010, but I work closely with some people who are still involved with them. So,
All right. Sorry about that, guys. Arctic.
Mine's Arctic. I basically came to doing true crime through all a personal experience. When I was 14 years old, my best friend was murdered, sexually assaulted, and thrown in a lake. And that prompted me to go to college for criminal justice and journalism. And rather than pursue a law enforcement career, I preferred to pursue the journalistic side and the investigative side. And so I started a YouTube channel, which is my primary platform, about 5 years ago. And I've got a podcast that I do on there. I just recently started doing more on the TikTok side of things, but I've helped so many families, and it just gives me satisfaction knowing that I'm getting these stories out there, that I'm, lending an ear and listening to these families when no one else seems to listen to them. Um, too often there's a lot of creators on these platforms that aren't, in my opinion, here for the right reasons. They're only here to get clicks and views and see how much money they can make off of a case. And, my platform's completely non-monetized. That's not why I'm here. I simply want to try to help bring these families back together, or in cases such as yours, bring justice to a crime that's, 20, 30, 40 years old and needs that justice brought.
Well, all of y'all sort of, this is just me, so I'm going to have to say it, but, one of the things that I've been trying to do presentations about and stuff is, there's a lot of secondary traumatization in, criminal justice, but also in podcasters and people who do a lot of this work. So the one thing I always say, I had to learn early on after dealing with my own PTSD before I started going into this field 35 years ago, that I really had to be sure that I was healed and take care of myself always emotionally. So, I just hope everybody who's doing this or involved at any level, that you also take care of yourself, because if you're always helping others, it helps us dissociate from our own stuff. But if we're not dealing with our own stuff too, then it can overwhelm you and burn out. So always be sure to take care of yourself.
Also, real quick, I want to introduce you, Maggie, to Bonnie. She is the sister of Danielle Bell. And to me, just to me, I feel that there are maybe some similarities between the two stories.
Okay.
In a way.
Hi, I'm Bonnie.
Hi.
Hey, Bonnie, how are you doing?
I'm okay. How are you all tonight?
Oh, we're doing okay. We were going over the case of Brittany Phillips. In the bottom box, we do have mom. 20 years ago, she was found strangled and raped in her apartment in Tulsa. And they still have not found the person who did it.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that.
Okay.
Do you have any suspects?
Yeah, we've got a whole bunch of suspects, but she said that she thought, it's a long story and I don't want to drag you through it all over again, stuff, but she said that she thought maybe we had some similarities in the case. So, what would be really good is if you can, on that QR code, that's the Facebook page where I'm probably more than my website and also my email. And so maybe, we can talk more about it. Oops, there you are.
Yeah, that'd be good. I'll do that.
And where are you?
I do feel like, especially within this community, like even though like it may not match up 100%, it is also good to like have people to talk to that can relate in a certain way,
And that's something, in 2011, I helped OSBI start a homicide survivors group. And I've been trying, now that I moved back to Tulsa about a year ago, I've been trying to get a group going here. You know, it's free of charge, nothing, you know, but one, being a homicide survivor, but two, being a trauma psychologist for 35 years. You know, I just, you know, I try to get names from, you know, Tulsa police, but I'm just going to start sending out stuff from the cold case list that they have and stuff. But, you know, there's also some talk about people wanting a virtual one. So even if you're not in Tulsa, you know, I'm going to try to offer that to people too. Because like you said, when you have similar situations, it's really good to have the support group. I mean, the support group at OSBI has been going, God, 15 years now, almost.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad that you said that. That's exactly what I'm looking for is
A trauma therapist. I've been in therapy on and off. Danielle went missing for 24 years, but it's just really hard to
Of
find
course.
someone that's focused on trauma.
Yeah. Well, and, you know, I can provide the support group and stuff, but since we're sort of getting to know each other here, but I can refer you to people I know who are good. You know, probably
Awesome.
I wouldn't be the best person because I'm sort of meeting you in a different context and stuff. But you know, but again too, and where are you?
I'm in Colorado.
Well, keep in touch with me because, you know, even though CrimeCon has its bad parts, it's shared my story and it's giving me a table, but I'm going to be in Denver definitely the beginning of September. I'm going to be traveling all across the West for the whole month of August, hopefully. So,
Okay.
but let's stay in touch and I'll connect you with people. And like I said, that QR code, you may have to remind me, yes, I was on the live, and yes, I was the person who's, you know, 23. Yes, I was on the live, and yes, I was the person who's, you know, 23 years or whatever. And so
Sure.
my old brain takes a minute sometimes to remember things.
No worries. I appreciate that. But yeah,
Brain takes a minute sometimes to remember things.
no worries. I appreciate that. But yeah, the support group is great.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. I appreciate you taking the time, Maggie, tonight to come and speak with us and tell us about your daughter and talk about her story tonight.
Well, this is always such a gift. You know, I always, you know, feel like I can never repay people for such a gift. And definitely all of you all have a place in my heart. You know?
Absolutely. And if there's anything any of us can ever do to help you out in any way, just reach out to us.
Definitely. Definitely. And same to anybody else.
Absolutely. Does anybody have any questions or anything that they would like to say to Maggie before we go ahead and
we just appreciate you being on here, Maggie.
Well, I appreciate you all being on here. So it's a mutual admiration club.
And Maggie, we're following each other on Facebook already.
Yeah, I thought you were familiar. I thought I had seen your name before.
Yeah, and I'm only 2 hours outside of Tulsa, so if there's anything that I can ever do to help, just reach out to me.
Sure, sure. Where are you?
I'm in Fort Smith, Arkansas.
Oh, I drive through there all the time. So.
and then
Yeah,
you
I
already know where I
actually
am.
Kim, oh gosh, I can't think of her name right now. I think it's Kim Cadell. But I've been I was out at a missing conference there about a year ago and stuff, and I still communicate. Patty Rush.
Oh yeah, Patty's been real big in the Nick case out here.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah, Patty's been real big in the Nick case out here.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I know her from there. So.
Yeah, I know Patty.
Small world. Okay,
So,
well, I will let
information, is it okay if I share Brittany's flyer to some Facebook groups in Oklahoma?
everywhere and anywhere.
Okay. Alrighty, since it's already like almost 11:30, I'll probably get started on that tomorrow.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll plan to get her flyers sent out to Facebook groups, and then we're roughly only about like a little over an hour away from each other. And whenever I'm in the Tulsa area, I can also get some flyers hang up
Yeah,
as well.
yeah, definitely. And I'm not going to Lawton that much, but I may be going there because I'm still trying to sell a home there. I may be going there like the second week in July there. I may be going there like the second week in July or something. So,
Well, we'll keep in touch and
yeah.
everything. And yeah, guys, if you guys haven't already done so, if you guys go over to our platform, you'll see this flyer. If you go ahead and you scan that QR code, sorry, it'll take you over to the Facebook group that Maggie does run herself. And then she does have a website as well. Did you want to talk a little bit about that, or?
Nah, I mean, because the website, oh, what's her face?
Domain.
Well, yeah, the domain is an issue, but I'm going to work on that. I just forgot her name.
Munchie.
Yes, thank you. Why would I forget that? I think that's such a unique name. I'm going to get Munchie to work with that on me. Yeah, so
Well,
I've got a
good.
list of things
Well,
that
at least, guys, if you do scan the QR code, it will at least take you over to the Facebook group.
Well, is it the Facebook group or the page?
I think it's the page.
Okay, cool. I mean, I've got
Sorry
groups,
about
but the
that,
page,
guys.
that's okay. I just finally, because I'm preparing all these flyers for CrimeCon and stuff, because they're giving me a table, and I just finally am no longer a QR code version. I put it on my magnets and on my bumper stickers. So I'm getting better.
Right? Practice makes perfect.
This is true.
All right, guys. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and get off for the night. Please stay tuned because I will be posting this to my YT channel. And then once that is posted, I encourage each and every one of you to help us share it out so that way many people are hearing this new interview about Brittany with her mother. And until then, I hope you get answers sooner rather than later. And you're in your thoughts and prayers.
You all are all such a gift.
So are you, Maggie. We think you're amazing.
No, thank you. Well, sleep well, everybody.
You too.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Bye.